She was refilling a goblet when she changed everything. That is the part no one who was present that night could ever fully explain afterward, not the language itself, not the elders, not even the king's expression in the moment it happened. What they could not explain was her. The stillness of her. The way she did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not seem to understand that what she was doing was impossible. She was a maid. She was holding a tray. And she corrected an elder of Ashen Peak in a language that has not been spoken by any living wolf in 4 generations. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. You need to see the room first. Welcome back. Thank you for being part of us. Subscribe, like and comment your city. I want to know where everyone is watching from. The Great Hall of King Varroc's fortress held 300 wolves that night, and every single one of them believed they understood the order of things. At the head table, the Alpha King himself, Varroc, 29 years old, 7 years into a reign built on conquest and maintained by the specific kind of intelligence that never lets anyone feel entirely safe. He sat with the relaxed authority of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. Dark eyes. A jaw carved like it had been put there on purpose. The kind of face that made people choose their words carefully. Around him, the nobility of Ashen Peak. Alphas of allied packs. Warriors with decorated arms and loudly won reputations. Ladies in silk who smiled at each other with their mouths and nowhere else. The hall was warm with candlelight and the low dangerous hum of powerful wolves in close quarters, all pretending to be civilized. Along the eastern wall, robed in deep burgundy, sat the 7 elders. They had traveled from the outer sanctum for this ceremony, the rite of continuance, performed once every decade, a sacred renewal of the kingdom's founding covenant. The room understood, instinctively, that the elders' presence elevated the evening into something that mattered. Conversation had dropped half a register the moment they were seated. Even King Varroc had straightened almost imperceptibly in his chair. Moving between the tables, invisible as furniture, a girl named Alara carried a tray and kept her eyes low. The eldest of the 7 elders rose. His name was Soren, and he was very old. Old enough that the wolves of Ashen Peak no longer thought of him as a person exactly, but as a condition of the world, like weather or stone. He had performed this rite 4 times before. He knew the words by heart. The hall fell completely silent. Soren drew a slow breath, and began. The ancient tongue moved through the room like a change in temperature. Most of the wolves present had never heard it spoken aloud. It did not sound like language at first. It sounded like the memory of language, like something the bones recognized before the mind could catch up. Nobles who had been exchanging glances a moment before went very still. Warriors who hadn't been still all evening stopped moving entirely. Soren's voice was steady, measured, and ancient. And then he made a mistake. It was small. A single phrase, a syllable dropped, a tonal shift that changed the meaning of what he was saying in a way that would have been invisible to every wolf in that room. Except one. The girl with the tray paused. She did not mean to. It was involuntary, the way you stop walking when you hear something wrong. Her head lifted the smallest degree. Her brow moved. And then, very softly, almost under her breath, as if she were simply thinking aloud rather than speaking into the most important room in the kingdom, she said the correct phrase. In flawless ancient tongue. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. The first silence had been respectful. Ceremonial. This one was shocking. Every head in the great hall turned. Nobles craned forward. Warriors frowned. King Varroc, who had been watching the elder with the patient attention of a man waiting for something to be finished, turned his gaze slowly, very slowly, toward the source of the sound. A maid. Holding a tray. Standing in the space between two tables with a jug of wine in her hand and her eyes now fully up, looking directly at Elder Soren with an expression that was not arrogance, not defiance, not even the awareness of having done something wrong. Just quiet certainty. Then someone laughed. It started at one of the warrior tables, a short, incredulous sound, and it spread the way fire spreads when the ground is dry. Within seconds the great hall had fractured from stunned silence into open, rolling laughter. Nobles exchanged looks of delighted disbelief. A lord near the back made a loud remark that drew another wave. A lady covered her mouth, eyes bright with it. King Varek did not laugh. But he smiled. Slowly, with the kind of patience that has teeth in it. He set down his goblet. "Come here," he said. His voice did not need to be loud. It never did. The laughter tapered. Elara crossed the hall. She stopped before the head table, tray still in her hands, and looked up at the Alpha King of Ashen Peak. "Tell me," Varek said, and the amusement in his voice was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to invite the room to enjoy it, sharp enough to carry a warning beneath it. "Which of my scholars sent a serving girl to correct my elders? Or did you learn the sacred language between the kitchen and the wine cellar?" More laughter. Louder this time. Elara said nothing for a moment. Then she set the tray down on the edge of the nearest table. Straightened. And spoke. Not in the common tongue. In ancient. Long fluid. Effortless. Not the single corrective phrase from before, a full response, fully formed, the words falling from her mouth the way water falls, like something that required no effort at all because it was simply what she was. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Instantly, cut off like a flame pinched between two fingers. Because no one understood what she had just said. No one in the room spoke ancient tongue. Not the scholars. Not the nobles. Not the warriors. Not even the king. The silence stretched. And then one of the elders, not Soren, one of the younger ones, a woman named Vale who had studied the ancient tongue longer than most wolves had been alive, made a sound. Not a word. A sound. Low. Involuntary. The sound a person makes when they see something they were certain could not exist. All 7 elders were staring at the maid now. And every single one of them looked terrified. Now. Before we go any further. You need to understand exactly what just happened in that room. Not the correction itself. Not even the language. You need to understand why 7 of the most powerful, most ancient, most unshakable wolves in the known territories looked at a serving girl holding a wine tray, and went pale. To understand that, you need to understand Ashen Peak. And to understand Ashen Peak, you need to understand one thing first. In this world, what you are is decided the moment you are born. And it does not change. The kingdom of Ashen Peak had stood for 1,000 years on a single idea. That power has a shape. That it moves in one direction, downward, from those born to hold it to those born to serve it. That this arrangement was not man-made, not political, not a choice anyone had made at any particular moment in history. It was natural. It was old. It was, according to every structure and tradition and sacred text the kingdom had built itself upon, the way things simply were. The mountain at the kingdom's center made this easy to believe. Ashen Peak itself, the physical mountain, rose from the territory like something deliberate. Dark rock, near black in certain light, with ridgelines so sharp they looked carved rather than formed. Ash drifted from vents near the summit on most mornings, pale gray against whatever color the sky was, settling over the villages and the fortress and the farmland below with the quiet consistency of something that had always happened and would always happen. The wolves who lived here said it was the breath of their ancestors. 1,000 years of ancestors, exhaling. Watching. The fortress sat at the mountain's base, not carved into the rock, but pressed against it, as if the mountain itself were a wall at its back. It was enormous in the way that things built to outlast their builders are enormous. Not elegant. Not decorative. Enduring. Stone that had absorbed 3 centuries of weather and barely registered it. Towers that rose with the particular confidence of structures that have never been successfully attacked. This was where King Varek ruled. This was where the hierarchy of Ashen Peak was, every single day, enacted, reinforced, and made real. At the top, the Alpha King. One wolf. Absolute sovereign. Commander of every pack within Ashen Peak's borders and several outside them who had learned, at considerable cost, that cooperation was the wiser option. The title was ancient, and it carried something beyond politics. In the founding texts, the ones the elders maintained and the scholars spent careers attempting to translate, the Alpha King was described not simply as a ruler but as a vessel. A living point of connection between the current generation of wolves and the first pack, the original bloodline from which all of Ashen Peak's power was believed to flow. Whether Varek believed this about himself, he never said. He didn't need to. He had other methods. Below the king, the elders. 7. Always 7. The number appeared in the founding texts repeatedly, associated with concepts that the scholars translated variously as completion, witness, and the full count of what must be remembered. The elders were not elected. They were not appointed by the king. They emerged, through a process of selection so old that its original logic had been largely lost, from the existing council when a position became vacant. They held no army. They commanded no territory. What they held was everything else. The elders were the living memory of Ashen Peak. Every treaty, every blood covenant, every sacred rite performed over 1,000 years existed in their minds, not in documents, not in archives, but in the direct, unbroken chain of instruction passed from one generation of elders to the next. They were the record. Lose them, and you lose the only authoritative account of what this kingdom actually was. This was why even Varek was careful with them. And this was why they performed the rite of continuance. Once every decade. A sacred renewal, a recitation of the founding covenant in the ancient tongue, the language in which that covenant was first spoken. Not translated. Not paraphrased. The original words, in the original language, were spoken aloud in the presence of the Alpha King and his full court. The elders knew these phrases the way you know a prayer learned in childhood, by sound, by rhythm, by the specific shape the words made in the mouth. Not by meaning. The meaning, they would tell you privately, had been largely lost. What mattered was the accurate recitation. The precise sounds. The unbroken continuity of the words themselves. This was what Elder Soren had been performing when the girl interrupted him. This was what she had corrected. Below the elders, the nobles. The old bloodline families. The heads of allied packs. The landowners and military commanders whose loyalty Varek maintained through a careful architecture of reward and consequence. They filled the high tables at ceremonies like this one, or their rank visibly, and operated under the shared understanding that their position, comfortable, prestigious, untouchable, depended on the hierarchy remaining exactly as it was. Change was not in their interest. It never is, for people at the top of a system they did not build. The warriors came next. Decorated with battle marks, fiercely proud, broadly contemptuous of ceremony while being careful to attend it. They respected one currency, demonstrated strength. Everything else was negotiable. And then, at the bottom, present in every room, invisible in all of them, the servants. They made the fortress function. They always had. And the unspoken agreement at the heart of Ashen Peak's social order was that this was appropriate, that the hierarchy was not merely political but biological, that those at the bottom were there because something in their nature placed them there, and that nature did not make mistakes. This agreement had been held for 1,000 years. It had never been seriously threatened. Until tonight. Because here is what you must understand about the ancient tongue. It was not simply old. The scholars of Ashen Peak, brilliant wolves who had dedicated decades to its study, described it in terms that made their colleagues uncomfortable, because the terms did not sound academic. They sounded almost afraid. The ancient tongue, they said, did not function like language. Modern speech communicates information. You select words that approximate what you mean, arrange them in patterns the listener will recognize, and hope the gap between what you intended and what they understand is small enough not to matter. It is, fundamentally, an act of approximation. The ancient tongue was something else. In the founding texts, in the fragments the elders had preserved and the scholars had partially reconstructed, the ancient tongue was described as the language of its direct understanding. Not words that pointed at meaning from a distance, but words that were meaning, that carried truth inside them the way living things carry blood. The first wolves did not use it to communicate. They used it to know. To establish reality between themselves with a precision that modern language could not approach. To speak it fluently, not the memorized phrases, not the ceremonial fragments, but fluently, the way you speak your mother tongue, was believed to require something that could not be taught. A specific heritage. A specific bloodline. The bloodline of the first wolves themselves. The scholars said this politely, carefully, with all the appropriate academic qualifications, and then they said the thing beneath it that they were less comfortable saying. The last wolf who had spoken the ancient tongue fluently had been the last of the founding royal line. And that line had died out. For generations ago. Everyone in that great hall understood this. The nobles understood it. The warriors understood it. King Varek understood it. The 7 elders understood it better than anyone. Which was why, when a serving girl set down her wine tray, looked up at the Alpha King of Ashen Peak, and spoke, not a phrase, not a fragment, but a full, fluid, effortless response in a language that should have been beyond any living wolf, the elders did not simply look surprised. They looked at her the way people look at something they had been certain was gone from the world. Something they had, privately, been afraid might one day return. Nobody in Ashen Peak truly knew where Elara came from. On paper, everything about her was ordinary. She had a recommendation letter, a village of origin, and a family name. Yet the details didn't hold up under scrutiny. The elder who signed her letter had died months before she arrived. The village had been abandoned. The family name appeared nowhere in the kingdom's records except in her own file. No one noticed. She was a servant, and servants were processed, not investigated. For 4 years, no one looked closer. Elara's days began before dawn. While the fortress slept, she spent her only private hour reading. Above her cot sat 7 books, an unusual collection for a servant. Some were written in forgotten languages. Others had been hidden deep within restricted archives and neglected storage rooms. She had always known where to find them. What troubled her was that she never knew how she knew. Even stranger, she could read texts she should never have been able to understand. She also kept journals. 6 completed volumes were hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The 7th remained open beside her bed. They were not diaries. They were a systematic reconstruction of the ancient tongue. For 4 years she had studied its grammar, syntax, and meaning. While the kingdom's greatest scholars struggled with fragments, Elara had nearly rebuilt the entire language. The servant sensed she was different. Mara once said Elara listened as though she already knew what people were going to say. Old Dreas tested her with an obscure historical reference. Within seconds she identified its source and exact location in the archives. When he verified it himself, he never asked how she knew. Among the servants, she became someone quietly respected and never fully understood. The nobles reacted differently. Lady Cressida disliked Elara almost immediately. She couldn't explain why. Elara was polite, flawless in her duties, and never gave cause for complaint. Yet Cressida always felt as though Elara's humility was a choice rather than a condition, as though beneath the servant's dress was someone who had never truly accepted a lower place. There was one secret Elara shared with no one. She dreamed in the ancient tongue. Every night. The dreams felt less like imagination and more like memory. She saw places she had never visited, heard voices she somehow understood, and always saw the same woman at the center of it all. Dark-haired. Amber-eyed. Looking at Elara with quiet certainty. The woman never spoke. But her expression always seemed to say, "Not yet." But soon. On the morning of the Feast of the Moon, Elara opened her latest journal and studied her newest notes. The reconstruction was nearly complete. For the first time in 4 years, she felt something she could not explain. Not anticipation. Recognition. As though she had been waiting for this day all along. The feast. The oath of shared sky. The ancient tongue. An elder she had already corrected once before. She had not planned what would happen that night. Yet somewhere deep inside, beyond reason and beyond memory, she knew it was coming. And when it arrived, nothing in Ashen Peak would ever be the same again. You already know his name. It was spoken in the great hall with the specific frequency reserved for people whose presence is felt before they enter a room. Mentioned in the servant quarters in lowered voices. Carried through the kingdom's outer territories as a warning dressed as a title. Alpha King Kaelin. Ruler of Ashen Peak. And the most dangerous wolf alive, not because anyone had declared him so, but because the wolves most qualified to dispute it had, one by one, decided against it. He had not inherited the throne. This was the first thing you needed to understand about Kaelin, because it was the thing he understood most deeply about himself, the bedrock fact beneath every decision he had ever made, every border he had pushed, every challenge he had answered before it fully formed. His father had been Alpha King before him. His grandfather before that. The bloodline was legitimate, the succession clean, the title his by every law Ashen Peak recognized. But he had not inherited it. He had taken it. At 22 years old, 3 months after his father's death, with 2 senior nobles already positioning themselves to contest the succession and a neighboring Alpha who had interpreted the transition as an opportunity, Kaelin had moved. Swiftly. Surgically. With a clarity of purpose that people who had underestimated him as a young wolf spent the rest of their lives reconsidering. The nobles had been politically outmaneuvered so cleanly they hadn't understood what happened until it was over. The neighboring Alpha had been met at the border with a force 3 times what he had prepared for, and offered a choice that was not really a choice. Both situations had been resolved within 6 weeks. No prolonged conflict. No public spectacle. No unnecessary damage to the kingdom's stability. Just results. That was Kaelin's signature. Not cruelty for its own sake, he was not that kind of ruler, and he had little patience for wolves who confused brutality with strength. What he possessed was something colder and more reliable than rage. The ability to assess a situation with complete honesty, identify the precise point of pressure, and apply exactly enough force to achieve the outcome he had already decided on. He was, by any serious measure, a brilliant strategist. And he had been told so often enough that it had stopped being information and became atmosphere, something he moved through without noticing, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own home. He had not taken a mate. He had not, in 7 years of rule, made a decision he publicly regretted. His court adored him and feared him in roughly equal measure, which was exactly the proportion he considered optimal. The nobles who had initially questioned his succession now competed for proximity to him, a proximity he rationed carefully, understanding that access was a form of currency that lost value if spent too freely. His warriors respected him with the specific, uncomplicated loyalty that soldiers give to a commander who has never sent them somewhere he wouldn't go himself. Even the visiting alphas, wolves who had every political incentive to find him lacking, came away from meetings with Kaelin with the particular quiet of people who had prepared a challenge and found, upon arrival, that the ground had already shifted beneath it. He was, on every visible surface, exactly what a king was supposed to be. But there was a thing beneath the surface. Not visible in council meetings. Not detectable in the yard. Something that only emerged in small, unguarded moments, a tightening around the eyes when something did not go as planned, a fractional pause before responding to information that contradicted his existing assessment. Kaelin had built his entire understanding of the world on a single principle. Worth is demonstrated. Worth is earned. Worth is proven through action, through strength, through the willingness to take what you are capable of holding. It was not a cruel philosophy, in his mind. It was honest. It was the most honest thing he knew. The world did not give you anything, the world tested you, and what you were was what survived the testing. Rank mattered because rank was the visible record of that survival. Title mattered because title was the acknowledgement by others that you had proven your worth in terms they could not dispute. A king was a king because he had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable challenge, that he was capable of being one. A servant was a servant because that was what they had demonstrated. What they had been tested on. He had never examined this logic too closely. It had never needed examining. In 7 years of rule, nothing in Kaelin's world had presented him with information that seriously challenged it. The hierarchy of Ashen Peak confirmed it daily. The behavior of every wolf around him confirmed it. The entire structure of the kingdom he had taken and held and expanded confirmed so consistently that the principle had stopped being a belief and became, simply, reality. The way things were. The way things had to be. He valued knowledge, but only certain kinds. Military knowledge. Strategic knowledge. Political knowledge. The kind that could be applied, the kind that had a function, that served a purpose, that contributed to the maintenance and expansion of power. He had respect for his scholars, genuine respect, in the way you respect a tool that does what it is designed to do. But the ancient tongue. The founding texts. The elders with their memorized ceremonies and their sacred fragments of a dead language. Tradition. Useful for cohesion. Necessary for the appearance of legitimacy. Valuable because the wolves of Ashen Peak needed to believe they were part of something ancient and significant, and a king who understood his people understood that this need was real and had to be fed. But the language itself, the meaning, the heritage, what it actually was. This was the man who would look across a great hall at a serving girl holding a wine tray. This was the man who would hear her speak the ancient tongue with a fluency that no living wolf possessed and feel something he had not felt in 7 years of ruling the most powerful kingdom in the territory. Not anger, not immediately. Something that arrived before anger. Something that his mind would refuse to name correctly for a very long time, because naming it correctly would require him to examine the logic he had built his entire world upon. The thing beneath the arrogance. The thing that arrogance is always, at its root, protecting. The fear that worth is not, in fact, something you can simply take and hold. That some things are given. And not to kings. The feast of the moon comes once a year, and for one night Ashen Peak pretends it is more than a kingdom held together by fear. Preparation begins 3 days early. Servants work in silence, rebuilding the great hall, polishing every surface. Because this is not just a ceremony, it is the one night all neighboring alphas gather before King Varek under the ancient oath of shared sky. They come dressed in diplomacy, surrounded by warriors, all of them smiling while watching for threats. The oath is ancient, meant to bind packs under the belief that the moon belongs to no single wolf. In practice, it is political theater. Elara serves in the East Corridor, moving silently among nobles who see her as invisible. But she understands the oath better than most, she has studied its ancient tongue texts in secret. When Elder Cavan begins the recitation, the hall falls into ritual silence. The words shift something instinctive in every wolf present. But Alara hears it immediately, a mistake. A single altered syllable changes the meaning of the oath completely, from shared covenant to dominance by the strongest wolf. A fatal inversion. Before she can stop herself, she corrects it aloud in the ancient tongue. Silence crashes through the hall. The elder stops. Every head turns toward Alara. Alpha Kalen of Iron Fang breaks the tension with a loud laugh, mocking her for speaking above her station. He turns the room against her, ridiculing the idea that a servant could know the ancient tongue. He demands she explain herself, stripping her of dignity in front of everyone. No one defends her. Not the servants. Not the scholars. Not even the elders. But Elder Soren watches her with something close to fear. Alara remains calm and explains. The oath was spoken incorrectly. If altered, it does not bind, it breaks the covenant. The room goes still again. Kalen, unsettled but unwilling to show it, orders her removed from the hall. As she is escorted out, Alara realizes the truth. The elders recognized her correction. Which means this was never about whether she was right. It is about what she represents, and what the kingdom will do now that her knowledge can no longer be ignored. They had expected her to apologize. That was the unspoken certainty in the great hall, that the servant girl would lower her head, accept dismissal, and vanish back into invisibility. That was how moments like this always ended. Alara did not. The head housekeeper tried to guide her out, hand lightly on her arm. A silent warning, leave before this becomes worse. Alara gently removed her hand. Then she turned back to the room. Alpha Kalen had already dismissed her in his mind, reaching for his goblet, satisfied that the situation was ending the proper way. Then Alara spoke. Not a phrase. Not a correction. She spoke in the ancient tongue, fluently, continuously, without hesitation. The effect was immediate. Sound collapsed. Laughter, conversation, movement, all of it stopped mid-breath as if the room itself had been muted. 300 wolves went still. Something in the language pressed against instinct itself, forcing attention deeper than thought. Kalen froze with his hand on his goblet. He understood none of it, but he felt it, something old in his body responding before his mind could resist. Not fear exactly. Recognition without context. The nobles reacted first with confusion, then discomfort. No one told them how to feel, so uncertainty spread. The warriors shifted forward instinctively, bodies reacting before thought, like something had issued a command without words. One veteran would later say, it felt like a command. Not speech. A command. The elders were the most disturbed. Elder Vale began silently tracking every word, her expression breaking as recognition set in, the grammar, the structure, the lost precision of a language they had spent decades reconstructing. Elder Cavan turned pale. Elder Soren did not move at all. Because he recognized what she was reciting. Not random speech, but a sealed passage from the Elder Council's forbidden archive. A text describing the identifying signs of the first wolf bloodline. A document no outsider had ever seen. Alara spoke for over 4 minutes without pause. Not improvising. Reciting. Perfectly. When she finally stopped, the room struggled to return to normal, as if reality itself had shifted and was only slowly settling back into place. Alara stood still, tray in hand, waiting. Elder Soren was the first to move. He exchanged quick, coded confirmations with the other elders, a silent protocol the room was never meant to witness. Then he rose. The Elder Council requests an immediate private session, he said. A pause. His gaze fixed on Alara. And the girl. The hall broke. Not into chaos, into recalculation. Whispers, shifting alliances, silent fear spreading through 300 wolves who no longer understood what they had just witnessed. Kalen remained seated. For 7 years, he had ruled with certainty, in a world that always made sense. Now he looked at Alara. And realized, for the first time in his reign, that he had no idea what she was. The private council chamber was the oldest room in Ashen Peak. Dark stone walls, no windows, no decorations. Only lines of ancient tongue carved into the stone itself. As Alara entered, she read every inscription automatically and stored the knowledge away for later. King Kalen arrived last. He took his seat and looked at Elder Soren. Explain. None of the elders sat. Standing together, they spoke with the full authority of the Elder Council. Soren placed both hands on the table. What the girl recited tonight is called the Passage of Returning. He explained that the text existed in only one place, a sealed manuscript hidden within the outer sanctum, protected by all 7 elders. No scholar, noble, or citizen had access to it. Yet Alara had recited it perfectly. Not a single mistake. How is that possible? Kalen asked. To answer, Soren revealed the truth behind the passage. Long before Ashen Peak became a kingdom, the first Luna feared her bloodline might one day be scattered and lost. So she created a safeguard. The Passage of Returning. It was more than a document. It was a key. A piece of knowledge that could not be learned through study or memorization. Only a direct descendant of the first Luna could truly know it. Not from books. From within. The room fell silent. Kalen listened carefully. You're describing hereditary memory. Yes, Soren replied. A bloodline believed extinct. The records say it vanished, Soren corrected. That is not the same thing. Kalen turned to Alara. You knew what you were reciting. Yes. For how long? Alara thought for a moment. I've studied the ancient tongue for 4 years. But the passage. She paused. I've known it for as long as I can remember. The silence deepened. Elder Cavan finally spoke. The bloodline was supposed to be gone. The historical records described a massacre 4 generations earlier. The last known descendants of the first Luna had supposedly been killed. Elder Vale spoke quietly. Most of the bodies were recovered. Most. The single word changed everything. Soren reached into his robes and placed an ancient seal on the table. Alara froze. She had seen the symbol before. In her dreams. Drawn unconsciously in the margins of her journals. This seal belonged to the first Luna, Soren said. It is the final proof of bloodline identity. Kalen's gaze sharpened. And if it responds to her, what does that mean for the kingdom? The question carried far more than curiosity. It carried politics. Power. The throne itself. Soren met the king's eyes. It means the throne of Ashen Peak has a prior claimant. The word struck the room like a physical blow. A claim older than the current royal line, Soren continued. Under the original covenant of this kingdom, such a claim cannot legally be ignored. For the first time, Kalen had no response. Slowly, Alara reached toward the seal. Her fingers touched the ancient metal. A soft amber light pulsed from within it. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief, warm glow lasting only a few seconds. Then it vanished. But every elder had seen it. And every elder knew exactly what it meant. For 4 generations they had preserved a secret protocol, passed down from elder to elder, preparing for a possibility none of them truly believed would happen. A set of instructions for one impossible event. What to do if the first Luna's bloodline ever returned. She had been 5 years old the first time she understood that her life was a secret. Not in the way children understand things, incompletely, emotionally, the understanding sitting in the body before it reaches the mind. She had understood it the way she understood most things, with a clarity that had always been, in her experience, simply how her mind worked. Directly. without the usual distance between perception and comprehension. She had been sitting at the kitchen table of a small house at the edge of a village that barely appeared on any map worth consulting, and the woman across from her, old, sharp-eyed, with hands that moved with the precise economy of someone who had long ago eliminated all unnecessary motion from her life, had placed a bowl of porridge in front of her and said, without preamble, without softening. "If anyone asks where you come from, you were born here. Your mother died in childbirth. You don't remember your father." Elara had looked at her. "Is that true?" she had asked. The old woman had looked back. "It's what's safe," she had said. "For now, that's more important." Her name was Marin. She was not Elara's grandmother, though Elara had called her that from the beginning, not because she was instructed to, but because the word had arrived naturally in the first week, the way words arrive when they are the correct ones. Marin had not corrected her. Had simply accepted it with the particular quiet of someone receiving something they had not expected and did not know how to hold. She was old in a way that resisted specific numbers. Her face held decades that had settled into something beyond age, into a kind of permanent weatheredness, the face of someone who had lived outdoors, under pressure, through things that had marked her not dramatically but continuously, the way water marks stone. Her hair had been white for as long as Elara could remember. Her eyes were gray, with a sharpness that belonged to a much younger woman and showed no signs of dimming. She had appeared to be, to the village around her, a retired herbalist. A healer of the quiet, practical kind, poultices and tinctures, assistance with difficult births, advice on fevers and infections. The village used her the way rural communities always use their healers, gratefully, a little suspiciously, and without asking too many questions about her past. This suited Marin. Elara would understand later how deliberately it had been constructed. How carefully maintained. How every element of their life in that village, the cottage at the edge, the practical trade, the unremarkable reputation, had been selected for its ability to render them invisible. At 5, she simply understood that Marin was safe. And that safety, in their life, required a specific kind of care. The lessons began when Elara was 6. Not school, there was no school in the village, and Marin had opinions about formal education that she expressed with the brevity of someone who considered the matter settled. She taught Elara herself, at the kitchen table, in the hours between the end of the afternoon and the beginning of dinner when the light through the small west window was best. Reading first, in the common tongue, briskly, with a thoroughness that had Elara moving through adult texts before her 8th birthday. Then figures. Then the history of the known territories, taught not from any standard text but from Marin's own account, delivered in the measured cadence of someone reciting from memory rather than reading from a page. The history Marin taught was different from the history the village children learned. It had different emphases. Different absences. Different moments that Marin lingered on, pausing, weighing her words, occasionally stopping entirely and looking at Elara with an expression that said she was deciding, in real time, how much to give and how much to hold back. At 8, Elara had asked her directly, "Why is your history different from everyone else's?" Marin had been quiet for a moment. "Because mine is accurate," she had said. And moved on. The language came last. Elara was 9 when Marin placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. Handwritten, in a script that Elara had never seen, not the common alphabet, not any of the variant scripts she had encountered in the texts Marin gave her, but something older. Something that looked less written than incised, as if the person who made it had been pressing meaning into the page rather than simply marking it. "What is this?" Elara had asked. "The beginning," Marin said. "Of what you actually are." She did not call it the ancient tongue. She called it the first language, and she taught it with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, but with a quality underneath the instruction that she brought to nothing else. A heightened attention. A watchfulness that Elara, even at 9, recognized as something beyond pedagogical care. Marin watched her learn it the way you watch something you have been waiting to see confirmed. Because Elara did not learn it. Not exactly. What happened, What Marin had apparently expected would happen, because her expression when it did was not surprise but relief, was that Alara remembered it. The first symbol on the first page, she looked at it for a moment, and something in her chest shifted, the way a door shifts when the correct key turns in it, and she said the sound it made before Marin had told her. The second symbol, the same. By the end of the first lesson, she had moved through 40 symbols and had not been wrong once. Marin had sat back in her chair at the end of it and looked at Alara for a long time without speaking. Her sharp gray eyes held something that Alara did not have a name for at 9 and would spend years learning to identify. Grief and relief, occupying the same moment. The expression of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down, but finds, in the setting down, that the weight was also the thing that kept them moving forward. Good, was all she said. The lessons continued for 4 years. Language. History. The old texts, introduced gradually, carefully, in an order that Alara understood later had been sequenced with considerable thought. Not the easiest first but the most necessary first. The ones that would build the framework into which everything subsequent could fit. And alongside the texts, the rules. Marin's rules. Stated clearly, repeated consistently, enforced not with punishment but with the particular gravity of someone who needed them understood at a level deeper than compliance. Do not speak the first language outside this house. Do not write it where it can be found. Do not tell anyone what you are studying. Do not ask, in any village, in any market, in any conversation with any person you do not know well enough to trust with your life, about the founding bloodline. About the first Luna. About any text or record that concerns the original pack. If anyone asks about your past, the story. Only the story. At 10, Alara had pushed back on this directly. She had always pushed back directly. It was the quality in her that Marin found simultaneously most difficult and most appropriate. Why, she had asked. Why can't I? Because, Marin had said, with a quietness that stopped the question more effectively than any sharpness could have, there are wolves who have been looking for you since before you were born. And if they find you before you are ready, she had stopped. Had looked at Alara with the gray eyes and the complicated grief and the absolute steadiness of someone delivering necessary information. The bloodline ends. Alara had not asked again. She had simply added it to the part of herself where she kept the things she did not yet understand but recognized as true. The dreams had started at 11. The dark-haired woman with amber eyes. The voice speaking in the first language with an intimacy that felt less like instruction than like recognition, like two people who know each other well, meeting after a long absence. The images of places Alara had never been and recognized anyway, the way you recognize things seen in a reflection rather than directly. She told Marin about the dreams. Marin had listened without interruption. Had asked 3 precise questions: what she said, whether she spoke back, whether anything in the dreams felt like warning rather than memory. Then she had nodded once, with the relief-grief expression, and said, "She's been waiting for you to be old enough to receive it." Who is she? A pause longer than most. Your ancestor. The first one. The one who made you possible. She had looked at the table for a moment, then backed up. She is why you remember the language. She is why you know things you haven't been taught. She built those things into the bloodline the way a craftsman builds a key, specifically, deliberately, for a specific lock. What lock? Alara had asked. And Marin had looked at her with the expression she used when she was deciding how much to give. Not yet, she had said. Soon. Soon it had not come. Not the way it was supposed to. Alara was 13 when Marin got sick. Not dramatically, Marin did not do things dramatically. A cough at first, the kind that arrives in autumn and is expected to leave with it. It didn't leave. It settled in with the particular patience of something that has found what it was looking for and intends to stay. By midwinter she was thinner. By spring she was not leaving the house. By early summer she was in the bed in the back room and Alara was running the household alone and spending every available hour at Marin's bedside, not because she was afraid, though she was afraid, but because she understood that the things Marin had not yet told her were still in there, behind the grey eyes that remained sharp even as everything else diminished, and that the window for receiving them was closing. The sealed text, she had said, one afternoon in late summer when Marin was having a better day, when she was sitting up and the light was good and Alara had decided to be direct. The one you haven't shown me. The one you said wasn't time for yet. She had looked at her. It's time. Marin had looked back. For a moment, a long one, something moved behind her eyes. The calculation of a woman deciding, for the last time, between protection and preparation. There is a vault, she had begun. In the outer sanctum of Ashen Peak. 7 seals. A manuscript. She had stopped. The cough came, the bad kind, the kind that took minutes rather than seconds, that required Alara to hold her upright and wait with the helpless patience of someone watching something they cannot stop. When it passed, Marin was exhausted in a way that was different from the exhaustion of previous days. She had looked at Alara with grey eyes. There isn't time, she had said. Not yet. Something final. Something that knew its own edges. Then tell me the most important thing, Alara had said. Her voice had been steady. She had made it steady. The one thing I cannot find without you. Marin had been quiet for a long time. You will know who you are, she had said finally, when the language speaks through you rather than from you. When you stop choosing to speak it and it simply, she had paused. When the distinction disappears. She had looked at Alara with something that was, finally, unguarded. All the careful management of her expression, years of it, decades of it, set aside. That is when you'll be ready. Not before. She had reached out. Taken Alara's hand. Some truths, she had said quietly, are safer hidden. But some truths, her grip had tightened, just slightly. Some truths are only safe when they are finally, completely, out in the open. Where no one can pretend anymore that they don't exist. She had closed her eyes. She had not opened them again. Alara had buried her in the small plot behind the cottage on a grey morning in early autumn. She stood at the grave for a long time afterward. Not crying, she had cried during the night, alone, in the specific way of someone who allows themselves exactly one interval of grief before they begin the next necessary thing. What she was doing at the grave was something else. She was making a list. Everything she knew. Everything she didn't. Every question Marin had answered and every question she had died still holding. Every fragment and every gap and every path forward that she could identify from where she currently stood. The ancient tongue, she had. Almost fully reconstructed, the last pieces coming together in the months since Marin had become too ill to teach. The history, partial. Enough framework, not enough detail. The vault. The 7 seals. The manuscript. Her own identity, the shape of it, the outline. Not the full picture. She had stood at the grave until she had the list complete. Then she went inside, packed the canvas bag, wrote the letter of recommendation in the careful hand she had been practicing, and began the 2-week walk to the fortress of Ashen Peak. She was 16 years old. She had not looked back. In the council chamber, Alara sat with her hands in her lap and the amber warmth of the seal's response still fading from her fingertips, and she looked at Elder Soren. There is a woman in the dreams, she said. She has been preparing me since I was 11. She paused. I think she has been waiting longer than that. Soren looked at her. She has been waiting, he said carefully, for 4 generations. The candle burned. The ancient walls held their text. And across the table, King Kalen, who had built a kingdom on the certainty that worth was earned, that power was taken, that bloodlines were history rather than living fact, sat in a silence that was no longer the silence of a man in control. It was the silence of a man standing at the edge of everything he had believed. Looking down. The announcement went out before dawn. Not through the usual channels, not the herald's formal proclamation, not the written notice posted at the fortress gates, not the measured, procedural communication that Ashen Peak used for official business. Elder Sorin sent runners. 7 of them, one from each elder, moving through the fortress and into the surrounding settlement in the dark hours before first light with a single spoken message. By order of the Elder Council, a full assembly of Ashen Peak is called for the 3rd bell of morning. The Great Hall. All residents. No exceptions. The last time the Elder Council had called a full assembly, not a feast, not a ceremony, not a political gathering convened at the king's pleasure, but a formal assembly called by the elders themselves under their founding authority, had been 63 years ago. Nobody currently living in the fortress had been present for it. But everybody knew what it meant. The elders did not call full assemblies for small things. By the 2nd bell, the fortress was awake. Not the gradual, reluctant waking of an ordinary morning, the sudden, electric waking of a place where something is happening and nobody yet knows what. Corridors that should have been empty held clusters of people speaking in low voices. The servant quarters, usually silent until the 4th bell, hummed with the specific tension of people who process uncertainty through movement, dressing quickly, gathering in doorways, exchanging fragments of information that were mostly questions and very little answer. Ilara was already awake. She had not slept. She had sat on the edge of her cot in the small room that had been her home for 4 years and looked at the shelf above her head, the 7 books, the worn spines, the single visible corner of the 7th journal that she had not fully pushed back into position before the night had overtaken her, and she had done what she always did when the thing she had been moving toward for years arrived at last. She had been still. Not calm exactly. Stillness and calm are different things. Calm is the absence of turbulence. Stillness is the decision to remain in place while the turbulence moves through you rather than moving with it. She had been still. And she had thought about Marin. The great hall held a different quality at the 3rd bell than it did at any other hour. The candles had been lit, all 300, the same formation as the feast, but the light they produced felt different without the context of celebration around it. Starker. More honest. The kind of light that shows you what a room actually is rather than what it has been dressed to appear. The wolves of Ashen Peak filled it in stages. The nobles arrived first, because they always arrived first to anything that might determine the social order, and tonight that instinct was sharper than usual. They came dressed, not in the full formal regalia of the feast, but dressed with intention, with the visible markers of rank prominent, as if they understood instinctively that whatever was about to happen might require the visual reminder of who held what position. The warriors came next, with the directness of people who move through ceremony efficiently and take their positions without performance. The servants came last, not because they had been told to, but because they always came last to things, from habit, from the accumulated understanding of a lifetime of occupying the edges of important rooms. Ilara came with them. She stood in the corridor where she had stood the night before, in the same position, with the same composed expression. She had no tray tonight. She had not been given one. Nobody had told her what to do this morning, which was itself a new development in 4 years of having every hour of her time accounted for. She stood and she waited and she watched the hall fill with the entire population of the fortress and some from the settlement beyond its walls, and she thought. This is what Marin was afraid of. And this is what she was preparing me for. Both things at once. The 7 elders entered from the eastern door. In their formal robes, the deep burgundy of the outer sanctum, the ones kept for rites rather than ordinary council business, they moved to the center of the hall rather than their usual positions along the wall. A table had been placed there. On it, covered in dark cloth, several objects whose shapes were visible as outlines but not yet as detailed. Elder Sorin stood at the table's head. He looked out at the assembled hall for a moment before speaking, not dramatically, but with the assessing attention of a man who is about to do something that cannot be undone and wants to be certain, one final time, that he is doing it correctly. The Elder Council has called this assembly, he said, under Article 7 of the Founding Covenant. The Article of Revelation, invoked when evidence arises that materially affects the established order of Ashen Peak and must be examined publicly, before the full community, rather than in private council. The hall was absolutely silent. Last night, during the Feast of the Moon, an event occurred that triggered this article. Before this assembly, we will conduct the trial of truth, the formal process of verification established by the Founding Covenant for circumstances of this specific nature. He paused. When the integrity of a bloodline claim is in question. The silence broke. Not into noise exactly, into the pressurized murmur of 300 wolves processing the same information simultaneously and arriving, with varying degrees of speed, at the same destination. Bloodline claim. The opposition came from the nobles, as Soren had known it would. Lord Edric, senior noble, head of the oldest non-royal bloodline in Ashen Peak, a wolf whose position in the hierarchy depended entirely on the current hierarchy remaining current, was on his feet before the murmur had fully settled. "This is irregular," he said. His voice was controlled, but only just. "A full assembly, called overnight, on the basis of, what? A servant girl who spoke some words at a feast. The Elder Council is proposing to invoke Article 7 over a parlor trick." Several nobles murmured agreement. Visible, encouraged agreement, the kind that gathers momentum from itself. "The trial of truth is not invoked lightly," Elder Vale said, from Soren's left. Her voice cut through the murmur cleanly. "It has not been invoked in living memory. The conditions for its invocation are specific and narrow. Last night, all of those conditions were met. This is not a discussion, Lord Edric. It is a notification." Edric remained standing. "And what exactly are we verifying?" "The bloodline of a maid with no documented ancestry and a convenient talent for." "Sit down, Edric." Kaelin's voice. From the head of the hall, where he had taken his position not at the feast table but standing, on the floor, in front of it, between the table and the assembled hall in a way that said, plainly, that tonight he was not above proceedings but within them. Edric sat. Not because the words were sharp, they weren't. Because the tone beneath them was the one that Kaelin used when the conversation was over, and every wolf in Ashen Peak had learned, at one point or another, to recognize it. Kaelin did not look at Edric after he sat. He looked at Soren. "Begin," he said. The trial of truth had 3 components. Elder Soren removed the dark cloth from the table. 3 objects. The first, a shallow stone bowl, the interior surface inscribed with symbols that matched the carved text on the council chamber walls. The blood record. The Founding Covenant required that any bloodline claim be tested against the original genetic record of the first pack, preserved through a process that the scholars classified as beyond their current understanding and the elders classified, simply, as old. A drop of blood from the claimant, placed in the bowl. The bowl's response, or absence of response, was the first verification. The second, a set of 7 seals, arranged in a specific pattern, each one corresponding to one of the 7 elder bloodlines that had been present at the founding. The historical seals. A descendant of the first Luna's line would be recognized by all 7, responding in a specific sequence established at the founding and documented in the Sanctum's restricted archive. The third object remained covered. The third component of the trial, Soren said, will be revealed if the first 2 are confirmed. He looked at the hull. It has not been used in 4 generations. He looked at Elara. It belonged to the first Luna herself. Elara crossed the hall. She was aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement, 300 wolves, the entire population of the fortress, watching a servant walk from the corridor wall to the center of the great hall with the specific attention reserved for things that are either about to be proven ridiculous or about to become irreversible. She stopped at the table. Soren placed a small blade beside the bowl. Ceremonial, not sharp enough to harm, designed for the single shallow cut the trial required. She did not wait for instruction. She drew the blade across her left palm, cleanly, without hesitation, and held her hand over the bowl. 3 drops. She stepped back. The reaction was not instant. 12 seconds, someone counted, later, of nothing. The blood rested in the bowl without visible response, dark against pale stone. Long enough that the murmur began again at the back of the noble section, low and pointed. Then the symbols on the interior surface began to illuminate. Not dramatically. The same quality of light as the seal in the council chamber, warm, amber, the color of something ancient rather than something performed. It moved through the inscribed symbols in a sequence, one after another, like a sentence being read. Finding each mark. Confirming it. Moving to the next. It took 40 seconds to complete the full circuit. Every symbol in the bowl was lit. The murmur died. Lord Edric, from his seat among the nobles, had gone very still. Sorin moved to the second component. The 7 historical seals, he arranged them in their sequence on the table and looked at Alara. She held her still bleeding hand over the first seal. The response was immediate this time. Amber light, immediate and certain, the seal recognizing something it had been designed to recognize and doing so without hesitation. The second seal, the same. Third, fourth. Fifth. With each confirmation, the quality of the silence in the hall shifted. Deepened. Took on the weight of something that was accumulating rather than simply continuing. The nobles who had been exchanging glances of skepticism had stopped exchanging anything. The warriors who had been standing with the comfortable detachment of people watching a procedure were standing differently now, with the forward-weighted attention of wolves whose instincts had been triggered. 6th seal. 7th. All 7 lit. All 7 in the confirmed sequence. No deviation. Elder Sorin stood at the table for a moment. He looked at the 7 illuminated seals. Then he reached for the cloth covering the third object. And removed it. The relic was a circlet. Simple in construction, hammered metal, not perfectly circular, with the slight irregularities of something made by hand rather than craft. The metal was not gold, not silver, something older than either, something that had no name in the current metallurgical vocabulary of the kingdom. It had been worn, visibly, the surface held the smoothing of long contact, of years of being handled, of existing in the world rather than in a vault. At its front, a single stone. Amber. Uncut. Not faceted, not shaped, a raw piece of amber the size of a thumb joint, set in a simple cradle of the ancient metal. Clouded slightly, the way amber clouds age, but with something moving inside it, or something that appeared to move, when the light caught it at a certain angle, like something suspended, waiting. The circlet of the first Luna. Worn on the day the founding covenant was sworn. Kept under seal for 4 generations, waiting for the head it had been made for. Sorin placed it on the table before Alara. He did not speak. The trial's protocol did not require instruction at this stage. Either the relic responded or it did not. Alara looked at it. For the first time since she had crossed the hall, something moved on her face. Not performance, the involuntary movement of recognition. The same feeling she had described to Sorin in the council chamber, the door and the key, the inside knowing. But stronger now. Larger. Less like a door and more like a room she had been living in the memory of for her entire life, suddenly, actually, opened. She reached out. Lifted the circlet. And placed it on her head. The amber stone lit first. Not the gradual, warming pulse of the bowl and the seals. Immediately. A light so clear and so certain it was almost sound, a frequency that hit somewhere below hearing, below thought, in the place where wolves carry their oldest knowing. It moved from the stone through the metal of the circlet the way current moves through wire, instant, total, purposeful, and when it reached the full circumference it did not stop there. It moved outward. Through the air of the great hall. A wave, not visible exactly, not the dramatic visible force of the stories, but felt. Every wolf in the room felt it pass through them. A pressure and a release simultaneously, like the moment after a held breath is let go. Some of them stepped back involuntarily. Some of them made sounds they would not remember making. Some of them simply went still, in the way of animals when something moves through the world that is larger than they have language for. The amber light from the circlet settled. Steady. Warm. Certain. Not fading. Staying. Elara stood in the center of the great hall with the circlet of the first Luna on her head and her hands at her sides and her eyes open. She was not performing composure anymore. She was simply herself. The version of herself that had existed underneath 4 years of invisibility, underneath the careful management of expression and position and the daily discipline of being unseen in important rooms. The thing that Marin had been protecting. The thing that Lady Cressida had felt without being able to name. The thing that the oldest part of the warrior Bryn had recognized at the feast and described, helplessly, as a command. She was not performing it. She was simply, no longer hiding it. Elder Sorin moved first. He stepped away from the table. He was 81 years old, and his knees had not been reliable for the better part of a decade, and the movement cost him something visible. But there was no hesitation in it. No calculation, no performance, no concession to the political complexity of the moment. He knelt. The motion of a wolf who has spent 60 years in the service of a truth he was beginning to believe he would never see confirmed, and has just seen it confirmed, and is responding to that confirmation with the only gesture commensurate with its weight. He bowed his head. Elder Vale moved before Sorin's head was fully down. To his left, down, without a word. Elder Cavan. To his right. Down. The remaining 4, in the time it takes to draw a breath, down. 7 elders. Kneeling. In the center of the great hall of Ashen Peak. Before a girl who had arrived 4 years ago with a canvas bag and a forged letter of recommendation and spent the intervening time refilling goblets and keeping her eyes appropriately low. The hall watched. 300 wolves, and not one of them moved or spoke. The silence was the deepest the great hall had held in living memory, not the silence of ceremony, not the silence of shock, not the silence of fear, but something that contained all 3 and was larger than any of them individually. The silence of a world that has just been reorganized. Of a truth that has just become, irrevocably, public. Some truths, Marin had said, are only safe when they are finally, completely, out in the open. Where no one can pretend anymore that they don't exist. It began at the back. A warrior, not Bryn, a younger one, a wolf who had felt the wave pass through him and whose body had apparently reached its own conclusion independently of whatever his mind was still attempting to process. He went to one knee. Quietly. Without announcement. The wolf beside him followed. Then the one beside that one. It moved through the warrior section the way the light had moved through the circlet, not in a dramatic sweep, but with the steady, certain momentum of something that cannot be stopped once it has begun. One wolf, then another, then the row, then the section. Into the servant quarters, where it required no time at all, where the people who had worked beside Elara for 4 years and had felt, without understanding, the quality of her that Lady Cressida had named as being assessed, they went down easily, with the specific relief of people whose instinct has finally been confirmed as instinct rather than imagining. Into the noble section. Here it was slower. Here there was resistance, the visible, physical resistance of people for whom kneeling carried a cost that the warriors and servants did not bear. The noble's position in the hierarchy was defined, in part, by who they knelt to and who they did not. To kneel to Elara was to restructure that calculus entirely, to acknowledge a claim that reordered every relationship in the room. But the trial of truth was not a political document. It was a founding document. And even the nobles, one by one, in the order of their own private calculations, went down. Lord Edric was last among them. He knelt with the expression of a man swallowing something that does not go easily, and he did not lift his head for a long time after. Kaelin had not moved. He stood where he had stood since the trial began, in front of the head table, on the floor with the rest of the hall, between the assembly and the proceedings. He had watched the blood record respond. He had watched all 7 historical seals confirm. He had watched the circlet light with a certainty that left no room for the interpretation he had been, somewhere beneath conscious thought, attempting to construct through the entire trial. An alternative explanation. Another reading of the evidence. The kind of reassessment that his mind performed automatically when faced with information that contradicted his existing framework, the swift, disciplined reanalysis that had served him, until tonight, with perfect reliability. There was no alternative reading. He had looked for it with the full force of an intelligence that had never yet failed to find a usable angle, and he had come back empty. The girl was who the trial said she was. Which meant everything he had believed about the order of things, about worth, about rank, about what the hierarchy of Ashen Peak was and why it existed, had just been tested against a truth older than the hierarchy itself. And the hierarchy had not won. He looked at Alara. She was looking back at him. Not with triumph. Not with the vindication he would have understood, that he could have categorized and responded to. Something quieter than triumph. The expression of someone who has waited a very long time for the world to see what she already knew, and finds, now that it has happened, that the waiting was the harder part, and that it is over. He thought about the feast. His voice in the great hall. Which of my scholars sent a serving girl to correct my elders? The laughter he had invited and the room that had given it to him and the girl who had stood through all of it with her tray in her hands and her back straight and an expression he had read as the blankness of someone who knew their place. He had been wrong about what that expression was. He had been wrong about most of it. Kalen did not make mistakes often. He had never made one of this magnitude. He looked at the circlet. The amber light, steady and certain on her brow. He looked at the 7 elders, heads bowed, on their knees before her. He looked at his hall, his fortress, his kingdom, built on 7 years of effort and certainty and the absolute conviction that he understood the order of things, and saw it looking back at him from its knees with the patience of something that has always known what it was waiting for. He thought of what Soren had said in the council chamber. The throne of Ashen Peak has a prior claim. 7 years. 7 years of a world that had confirmed, every single day, the principle he had built his understanding on. Worth is demonstrated. Worth is earned. Worth is proven. And here, in the center of his great hall, in the light of 300 candles, with the founding relic of his kingdom lit with a certainty that no political authority could produce or revoke. A woman who had spent 4 years refilling his goblet stood in the proof that some things were not earned. Some things were given. Before any of them were born. Before the kingdom existed to have an order. Before there was a hierarchy to sit at the top of. Kalen looked at Alara for a long moment. In the silence. In the amber light. With the expression of a man who has just had the ground removed from beneath something he had been standing on for so long he had stopped feeling it as ground and started feeling it as self. And then, slowly. With the deliberate, unperformed movement of a wolf who has assessed a truth and found it incontestable. He went to one knee. The Alpha King of Ashen Peak. Before the last daughter of the first Luna. His head bowed. The hall held its breath. And the amber light from the ancient circlet burned steadily in the silence. Warm. Patient. As if it had never doubted, for a single moment across 4 generations of waiting, that this was exactly where it would end up. The hall stayed on its knees for a long moment. Then Kalen rose. He crossed the floor alone, no guard, no ceremony, no political scaffolding of any kind. Just a man walking toward a reckoning he had earned. The hall watched in silence as the Alpha King of Ashen Peak covered the distance between himself and the girl he had laughed at 24 hours ago. He stopped before her. Up close, the amber light from the circlet caught the angles of his face differently than the candlelight had at the feast. Harder. More honest. The face of someone who has had something stripped away and is standing in what remains. He did not reach for dignity. He did not reach for an explanation. I was wrong, he said. 3 words. Spoken into the silence of 300 wolves, with the plain, unqualified directness of someone who has decided that anything less would be another form of dishonesty. I heard you correct an elder in a language I did not understand, and I chose mockery because mockery was easier than curiosity. Because your position told me what you were before I looked at what you actually are. He paused. I was wrong. Publicly. And I am sorry. Publicly. No performance in it. No careful management of how it would land. Just the words, set down in front of her without decoration. The hall was completely still. Elara looked at him for a moment. I accept your apology, she said. Then, quietly, not unkindly, but with the precision of someone who has spent 4 years in this fortress learning exactly what its fundamental problem was. But the apology is not the lesson, Your Majesty. Kaelin held her gaze. Then what is? She reached up. Touched the circlet once, briefly. You were not wrong because I turned out to be someone important. You were wrong the moment you laughed. She let that settle. A crown reveals power, she said. Character reveals worth. Those are not the same thing. This kingdom has been treating them as the same thing for a very long time. Kaelin said nothing for a moment. The silence of a man receiving something he knows is true and is deciding, consciously, not to defend against it. Yes, he said finally. It has. It was not an agreement for the room's benefit. It was the first honest thing the Great Hall of Ashen Peak had heard from its king in 7 years. The weeks that followed moved quietly but irrevocably. The royal scholars were given access to the Elder Archive for the first time in the kingdom's history. The ancient tongue, dead for 4 generations, buried under assumption and neglect, began, haltingly, to breathe again. Elara sat with them daily. Patient. Precise. Giving them not just the language but the logic beneath it, the structure that made it livable rather than merely memorizable. She took her seat beside the Elder Council not as a supplicant, not as a curiosity, but as what the founding covenant had always intended there to be, a living voice of the first Luna's line, present in the room where decisions were made. The kingdom did not transform overnight. Kingdoms never do. But something had shifted in the foundation. Something that could not be unshifted. The thing that stayed with those who had been present in the Great Hall, that they returned to, privately, in the months after, was not the light from the circlet, not the elders kneeling, not even the king's apology. It was the simpler thing. The thing that had been true the entire time. For 4 years, the greatest living repository of the ancient tongue, the last voice of the founding bloodline, the key to knowledge the kingdom had spent generations trying to reconstruct, had walked these corridors every day. Had refilled their goblets. Had kept her eyes appropriately low. And not one of them had looked. The kingdom of Ashen Peak had nearly lost its greatest treasure. Not to war. Not to steal. Not to any of the dramatic forces that kingdoms prepare against. To assume. To the ancient, comfortable human habit of deciding what something is worth before you have looked at what it actually is. The Alpha King thought he was judging a maid. In truth, he was standing before the last voice of a forgotten age. And the moment she spoke, history remembered her name. But here is what the kingdom did not yet know. What even Elara, with her 4 years of reconstruction and her journals and her dreams, had not yet reached. The ancient tongue was not simply a language. It was a key. And Elara's bloodline was not the only secret it had been keeping. If you want to know what the ancient tongue was truly hiding, and why the first Luna encoded it in a bloodline rather than a text, that story is coming. Subscribe. And do not miss it.